The panelists, please. I think that they've set us up nicely for a really rich discussion.
Greetings. So I have been living in London for about sort of 30 years, hence the accent. I don't really sound very Trinidadian anymore, but I am from here. I just had a few comments.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Isis, like the goddess. Not the other group.
Not the other one.
Not the CIA sponsored group.
Well then.
So my comments, I want to thank everyone first of all for putting this on. It's a really good event, really needed, and I certainly think since I've been here, for me, equality and human rights, which is something I work in the UK, is a major issue in Trinidad. I would deviate slightly from the title. Had I been doing something like this, I would have been talking, rather than deconstructing masculinity, I'd be looking at deconstructing society. Because I think much of what I've heard comes back to the issue that it's a societal problem. The violence that we're talking about against women is clearly a major issue in the Caribbean, as it is globally. And I take on board the comments of one of the first speakers, Ms. Zoric. And it's a problem we have all across Europe and everywhere else. However, for me, one of the issues around the problems for men in the society is the issue of race. We're talking about human rights, and you've spoken about the project. One of the things missing is I think actually Levi mentioned it, but the whole narrative around race and power, around white supremacy, and around the fact that still in the Caribbean, I've come back after 40 years, and I'm still seeing that in positions of power, the least melanated people are generally in those positions. And I think when we look at the murder of lots of schoolboys, sort of 16 and under, these are children, and they themselves are victims. And we have lots of issues of violence against children, sexual violence against children in the society. And if you make the connection, if young boys, particularly very melanated boys, are seen as not having any value in this society, they become those men who then perpetrate violence because of the lack of power. Lack of power breeds violence, and I think you kind of touched on it, Levi. And I think there should be a lot more discourse around the lack of value and why it is that in the Caribbean, very melanated men in particular are in such positions. And I think we need to address that as a societal issue to move forward to then address why women then become the victims of these men and the children. So those are my points, really.
Thank you very much. We have a question over here.
Hi, good afternoon. Sharon Motley, PSI Caribbean. I don't have a question. I'm sort of just focusing on broadening the discussion and understanding about masculinities. And the only two things I'll say is to watch The Mask You Live In. It's a documentary, go online. It provides an understanding of men and boys. It's American context, but it's very relevant to what we've seen in Trinidad and Tobago. And there's also the Center for Study of Men and Masculinities. That's in Stony Brook University. There's a lot of information out there, and hopefully some of our esteemed people up here at IGDS will be doing some work around men and masculinities. Thank you.
Two more, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Hi, good afternoon, Brandon O'Brien. One of the things that I kind of noticed, and I know that everybody was trying to get to that point, but I feel like we didn't focus as much as I would have liked, is how we could actually, as a community, work towards consciously reshaping the ideas of masculinity that presently already exist. We spoke a lot about what masculinity presently looks like, especially in the Caribbean, but we haven't actually found a great deal of solutions in general space about how we can teach young men to envision themselves as masculine in different ways than we presently do. How we can teach men that being nurturing, being compassionate, and being open about their emotions is actually generally more positive and empowers them to have more conscious interactions with other people, to be more extroverted, to be more confident, to be defenders of their space, not because other people are weak, but because defending other people is a significantly good thing to do. I think that it's important that one of the ways that we can reshape the space that we live in is not only to protect people from gender-based violence, but to put social structures in place that empower young men in schools and in homes to feel as if not doing this thing that they have been taught is a positive masculine thing to do is actually more empowering in their space and allows them to be more positive and more empowering to other young men and to their families and their wives and girlfriends, etc. So I'd like to hear somebody actually respond to that, but it wasn't really a question. So yeah, thank you.
One more right up. There we go.
Thank you. Good evening, Rochelle Nake, Living Water Community. Ms. Pargass, when you had the list of actors involved, one of the things that I did not see was psychologists, and it's come out later on in terms of dealing with the victim, but there's a disturbing connection between personality disorders and domestic violence, and it's something that I think is missing in our discourse about domestic violence, the effect of, say, narcissistic personality disorders and antisocial personality disorders, which interestingly occur most frequently in men. So I think some, exploring whether, there's some connection between these personality disorders and masculinity would be quite interesting, and involving psychologists, not just in terms of assisting the victims, but in helping to identify these personality disorders, because obviously the judicial system would be, the actors are incapable of identifying it, even though they may see the persistent characteristics of it over time and become sensitive to it over time.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to put all of those questions to the panel. So you have a question about deconstructing society, whether it's about a power narrative or a narrative about degrees of melanin, or is it a masculinity narrative, or whether it's all of those things. You also have a suggestion to look at some material. But the other questions were about asking about whether we have a strategy for reconstructing masculinity as opposed to sitting here and deconstructing it. And then the question about psychologists. And just on that, I think there is a level of psychological trauma that women, or rather the victims, experience as a failure of the institutions to address their cases correctly. I was recently at the University of British Columbia, and there was a huge case about a PhD student who had been sexually abused. And some of the professors, I put this out to you, had got together and defended her on the basis that there was a duty of care on the basis of the university to take her seriously, to treat with her in a particular way, and this was denied, and that had a particular impact on her. So it goes both ways in terms of the psychological.
So I wanted to piggyback off of you, and also if it was Brandon. So one piece that I think was missing from this conversation, actually there's a lot of pieces missing from this conversation, there's just only so few of us and so little time. But I think one piece that's missing in the conversation is what these traditional conceptions of masculinity and femininity, or hegemonic conceptions of masculinity and femininity, the trauma that creates from a very young age. And as some of my poverty law clinic students know, I actually had a woman speak to our class about what's called trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care basically comes from a perspective, it looks at what's called childhood trauma. And if anyone's interested, there's this site called ACE's Connection, and it's about adverse childhood experience. And much of what I'm going to call, and I know that this is controversial, but what I'm going to call the man box, and what is imposed on boys, which is also discussed in the Masculine, is in fact inflicting trauma on our children. It is minor trauma that builds up over time. And that much of the violence that is being exhibited in whichever way we're seeing it is in fact a manifestation of that trauma, and one way in which we are surviving through it. So trauma-informed care, which this is, I'm sorry, I'm stepping outside of my role as an attorney, I'm stepping outside of my role as a lecturer in the Faculty of Law. This is much more in the world of social work, psychology, sociology, etc. But trauma-informed care is an approach that has consistently shown to reduce violence, to build resilience, to empower individuals to construct for themselves their own conception of who they are in all these intersecting identities. I know I should probably stop soon. But I'm really going to push this. There's this, again, it's called trauma-informed care. There's trauma-informed systems of care, ACEs connection. There's also other movements, and there's some of this here. I know the U.S. Embassy is going to be putting on a 3-day workshop on trauma and the brain that really begins to look at and explore all these intersecting kind of, I guess, weights that are being placed upon our children who are growing in this, that we ourselves contributing to, yeah? And I really do think that one of the ways to deal with this is by nurturing and moving into a safer space for self-expression, self-empowerment. And I'll stop. I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe Gaietry and Levi also on the question.
Okay, I just wanted to address briefly the comment by the Living Water Community representative, and to say that you're right, but what I was speaking to was they were the actual actors in the criminal justice system and in the judicial system that victims encounter. But I want to add to that the law is making incremental gains, not massive gains, but incremental gains, because the more we understand trauma, the more we understand causes of violence, it's the more that the law will become imbued with that understanding. And I just want to give one example. A recent example, the Children Act 2012, which was proclaimed on May 18th, 2015, sorry to know the dates so well, but I worked intimately with it. In dealing, the Act provides that in dealing with child offenders, once an offender is charged, or if an offender is not, whether on bail or not, that child must be assessed. And that child offender must be assessed by the Children's Authority. And the Children's Authority has at its disposal a range of persons, including psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, and so on. So that is already in place and taking place when it comes to child offenders. It is also taking place with child victims on a massive scale, because they've already assessed over 150 victims. A second part to that, when it comes to the law and how the law begins to take these things into consideration, is when the court is pronouncing its sentence on a child offender, and it's in the Act, which I have here. The court can call upon, and it's in the Act, which is really very progressive, a range of persons to investigate further and to make submissions to the court and recommendations as to what should be the sentence. The thinking behind that is precisely as you are saying, that crime, violence, and so on may be driven by various issues, which the court may not necessarily have an understanding of. And so the law is now seeking to actually deal with that in the statute. So hopefully we will arrive at a point where there is such a learning built up that we will begin to take it as normal rather than abnormal, which is one purpose of the law.
Levi, on the question of the...
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible as well. In terms of solutions or what we can kind of do in the community and grassroots level, I'll have some suggestions, of course, and we'll ramble on about those. And then also in terms of looking at sort of deconstructing society, I think that's necessary. And then also very much doing it with a sense or with a disposition towards looking at systems of power. So in terms of looking at society and talking about colonialism, capitalism, and even sort of the dreaded word patriarchy. I think we need to sort of address patriarchal social relations. Now, how do we do that in terms of reconstructing society into creating a better new world, sort of re-envisioning things? I think it needs to be done collectively. I think that's essentially paramount in terms of transforming anything that's taking place in society. And then I also sort of would like, or would even suggest, that it kind of needs to come from the bottom up. I don't have very much trust in the state to do this. I don't have very much trust in supranational organizations to do this. I think grassroots organizing, collective coming together, sharing stories, listening to stories, building critical mass, and then basically changing things. On that note, in particular, I think within like sort of the local context of Trinidad and Tobago, and just studying gender and even in my geography classes, I think it's very important for men and young men to join their local pro-feminist grassroots collective, if there is one. If there isn't one, develop one, right? And I learned and heard some very important statements that I'll just share kind of in my experience in Mexico, and one was to abandon your fear of difference. And that's sort of a statement that's made early on, that's been implemented into an autonomous education in Mexico. They teach children from a very early age to abandon their fear of difference. They also sort of have a statement, and I can't pronounce it necessarily in Spanish very fluently, but the statement they teach at a very early age in their school system is also, when a woman advances, no man is left behind, which is a very powerful statement. And it's a very sort of humble and dignified statement to get behind on. And so sort of, how can we take those statements, when a woman advances, no man is left behind, as well as abandoning our fear of difference, and do things grassroots and collectively, particularly men, engaging in pro-feminist social relations. And then keeping in mind, sort of mediating that, race, class, gender. I don't think there's any part of the globe that hasn't been touched by white supremacy. And sort of when white supremacy imposes itself upon different geographies, oppressed, disempowered people react in very destructive ways sometimes. And so how do we overcome those things? I think it's collectively, I think it's through grassroots organization, and I think it's through concentrating on dismantling those systems of power. Now, individually, 2 quick suggestions that are even rooted and I think kind of organic to the Caribbean. Read Audre Lorde and read Frantz Fanon.